Metro 2033, Dmitry Glukhovsky, Chapter 14. There Up Above. Before reaching the old stone man in the easy chair, Artyom turned left in order to cut across the corner of the street along the library steps. Passing it, he glanced at the majestic building, and a shiver went down his spine. Artyom remembered the terrible inhabitants of the place. Now the library once more was immersed in dreary silence. The custodians of the predominant silence in it most likely had dispersed among the dark corners, licking their wounds after their impudent incursions and preparing to pay the next adventurers back for it. The pallid, drained face of Daniel appeared before his eyes. It occurred to Artyom that the Brahmin, not without reason, had been frightened of these creatures, refusing even to speak of them. Had he seen his own death in his nightmares? His body would remain forever lying in the stacks, embracing the librarian who had killed him. Of course, if these creatures disdain carrion. Artyom winced. Would he ever be able to forget how his partner, who had become almost a friend to him in only 2 days, had died? It seemed to him that Daniel would trouble his dreams for a while longer, trying again and again to speak with him in the night, putting together indistinct words with his blood-stained lips. Exiting onto the broad avenue, Artyom hastily turned over in his mind the instructions given him by Melnik. Go straight to the Kalininsky intersection with Sadovoye Koltso. Do not turn off anywhere. Try to guess again which of the streets is Koltso itself. Don't go into the middle of the road, but also don't press up to the walls of the houses, and mainly, get to Smolenskaya before the sun comes up. The famous Kalininsky high-rises, which Artyom knew from the yellowed postcards with views of Moscow, began half a kilometer from the very place where he was standing. Now, low detached houses stood along the sides of the street, which curved left into New Arbat. The outlines of buildings, clear close-up, blurred when he moved away, and they blended into the twilight. The moon was hidden behind low clouds. The meager, milky light barely filtered through them, and only when the misty curtain had dissipated did the ghostly silhouettes of the homes again take shape for a short while. But even in such lighting, in the alleys that dissected the street every 100 meters, the powerful contour of an ancient cathedral could be seen on the left. A huge winged shadow once more circled over the cross-capped dome. Perhaps it was for that reason Artyom stopped in order to look at the soaring beast in the air that he noticed it. It was hard to determine in the twilight whether his imagination was drawing the strange figure that had stopped dead in the depths of the alley and had fused with the partly destroyed walls of the houses. And only when he examined it further did it appear to him that this blob of darkness moved a little and possessed its own free will. It wasn't easy to determine precisely the form and dimensions of the creature at such a distance, but it clearly stood on 2 legs, and Artyom decided to act as the stalker had told him. Switching on his flashlight, he aimed the beam into the alley and made a circular movement with it 3 times. There was no response. Artyom waited for it in vain for a minute until he realized that staying in that same place could be very dangerous. But before he could go on, he illuminated the motionless figure in the alley again. What he saw forced him to turn off his flashlight immediately and try to pass the alley as soon as he could. It clearly had not been a man. Its silhouette had become more distinct in the spot of light, and it was no less than 2.5 meters. Its shoulders and neck were missing, and the large round head emerged directly from a powerful body. The creature had hidden, biding its time. Despite this apparent indecisiveness, Artyom felt in his bones a threat from it. He did the 150 meters to the last alley in less than a minute. Taking a hard look, he understood that it wasn't even an alley, but an opening burnt into a residential neighborhood by some kind of weapon. They had either bombed here or simply demolished a whole row of buildings with heavy military equipment. Artyom looked with curiosity at the half-ruined homes fading into the distance, but then his attention was fixed on the unclear, motionless shadow. It was enough to put the beam of the flashlight on it for a second to dispel all doubt. It was that very same creature or its mate, standing right in the middle of the alley in the same block. It wasn't even trying to hide. If the creature was the same one he had observed in the block behind him earlier, that meant it had snuck along the street parallel to the one he was walking along, Artyom thought. It turned out that it had covered this distance twice as fast as he, for at the very moment he reached the next crossing, it was already waiting for him there. But something else was even worse. This time, he also saw a similar figure in the alley to the right of the avenue. As the first one, it was standing there, frozen in place, like a statue. For a moment, Artyom thought that perhaps they weren't living beings, but signs placed here by someone for intimidation or as a warning. He was already running to the third intersection, stopping only at the last detached house to look carefully around the corner into the alley and make certain that the mysterious pursuers had outpaced him once more. There already were several of the huge figures, and now they were a little easier to see. The layer of clouds that had been covering the moon had thinned out a little, and as before the creatures stood there, not stirring, as if waiting until he appeared in the opening between the houses. And for all that, had he not deceived himself, taking stone or concrete stubs of collapsed structures for living beings? His acute senses were able to stand him in good stead down below, in the metro. On the surface lay a deceptive world, unknown to him, and here everything was different and life went on with different rules. He was no longer justified in relying on his impressions and intuition. Having tried to dart past a new alley as quickly and inconspicuously as possible, Artyom pressed himself against the wall of a house, waited a second, and again looked around the corner. He gasped. The figures were moving, and in a surprising manner, stretching still higher and raising its head as if sniffing the air. One of them unexpectedly dropped onto all fours and disappeared around the corner in one long bound. The rest followed it several seconds later. Artyom moved back, hid, and sitting onto the ground, caught his breath. There were no more doubts. They were pursuing him. It was as if the creatures were leading him, moving along parallel streets. They were biding their time until he passed a new opening. They would appear in an alley to make certain that he had not deviated from his route, and they continued their silent shadowing of him. Why? Choosing a suitable moment for an attack? Simply out of curiosity? Why hadn't they made up their minds to come out to the avenue, preferring to hide in the gloomy shadows? He again recalled Melnik's words, which forbade him to turn away from the straight road. Was it because they were laying in wait for him there, and Melnik knew about this danger? In order to calm down, Artyom replaced the clip in his machine gun, pulled back the bolt, and turned the laser gun sight on and off. He was well armed, and in contrast to the library, was able to shoot here without any dangers. It would be easier to defend himself. Taking a deep breath, he got to his feet. The stalker had forbidden him to stop and waste time. He had to hurry. It seemed that here, on the surface, one always had to hurry. Passing another block, Artyom slowed his pace in order to look around. The street here had got wider, forming something like a square, part of which, cut off from the road by a fence, had been converted into a park. In any case, it looked as if there had been a park there at some time. Trees still stood in places, but they were not at all the trees Artyom had happened to see in postcards and photographs. Thick, gnarled trunks carried spreading crowns to a height of a 5-story building which stood to the rear of the park. Most likely, the stalkers went to such parks for the firewood that heated and lit the whole metro. Strange shadows flickered in the spaces between the trunks, and somewhere in the distance a faint fire flickered. Artyom would have taken it for the flame of a bonfire if it were not for its yellowish color. The building itself also looked sinister. It created the impression that it had been the arena of brutal and bloody clashes more than once. Its upper floors had collapsed, and in many places bullet holes showed black. In places, only 2 walls remained intact, and the dim night sky was visible through empty windows. The buildings parted beyond the square, and a broad boulevard intersected the street. Above him, appearing out of the darkness like watchtowers, rose the first high-rise buildings of New Arbat. Judging by the map, entry to Arbatskaya should have been located nearby to his left. Artyom again looked at the gloomy park. Melnik had been right. One didn't want to delve deeply into this labyrinth while trying to find a descent into the metro within it. The longer he stared at the black bushes scattered next to the base of the ruined structure, the greater it seemed to him that he saw those most mysterious figures that had been following him earlier moving among the roots of the giant trees. A swooping puff of wind shook the heavy branches, and the crowns creaked under the strain. The wind carried some drawn-out wail from afar. The thicket itself was quiet, but not because it was dead. Its silence was akin to the hush of Artyom's mysterious pursuers, and it seemed it too was waiting for something. Artyom was overtaken by the feeling that if he stopped here, examining the park's innermost depths, he could not escape retribution. He better gripped his machine gun, looked around to see if the creatures had approached, and moved forward. But only several seconds later he stopped again, when he was crossing the boulevards in front of the start of Kalininsky Prospect. Such a view was revealed here that Artyom simply was unable to force himself to go further. He was standing at an X-shaped intersection of wide roads, along which vehicles must have driven at one time. The junction had been constructed in an unusual way. Part of the asphalt road went into a tunnel and then emerged at the surface again. On the right, boulevards went into the distance. It was possible to recognize them by a black line of trees, just as huge as those past which he had just made his way. A large square covered with asphalt was seen on the left, a complex tangle of numerous paths, beyond which the brush began again. Now it was possible to see further, and Artyom asked himself whether the rising of the frightful sun was already nearing. The roads were strewn with deformed and burnt carcasses of automobiles. Nothing else was left here. In 2 decades of trips to the surface, stalkers had succeeded in getting hold of everything they possibly could. Gasoline from fuel tanks, batteries and generators, headlights and traffic signals, seats torn out with flesh still on them. It had even been possible to find all this at VDNKH and at any huge market in the metro. The asphalt had been dug out, and craters and wide cracks could be seen everywhere. Grass and soft stems poked through, bending beneath the weight of their crowning balls filled apparently with seeds. The murky gorge of New Arbat came into view directly ahead of Artyom. On one side, formed for some unknown reason of undamaged houses, resembling open books in layout, and on the other of partly collapsed high-rise buildings, about 20 stories high. The road to the library and the Kremlin remained behind Artyom. He was standing in the middle of this majestic cemetery of civilization and felt like an archaeologist, uncovering an ancient city, the remnants of a bygone power and beauties of which even many centuries later forced those seeing it to experience the chill of awe. He tried to imagine how the people who populated these gigantic buildings, who moved in these vehicles, then still sparkling with fresh paint and rustling softly along the smooth road surface warmed with the rubber of wheels, and who descended into the metro, only to get from one point of this boundless city to another more quickly, had lived. It was impossible. What had they thought about every day? What had bothered them? Just what can bother people if they don't have to be concerned about their lives every second and constantly fight for it, trying to extend it at least for a day? At this moment, the clouds finally dissipated, and a piece of the yellowish disk of the moon was seen, striated with strange drawings. The bright light that fell through the hole in the clouds inundated the dead city, intensifying its gloomy magnificence 100-fold. The houses and trees, until now looking like only flat and disembodied silhouettes, had returned to life and acquired dimension. Unable to move from the place, Artyom looked, spellbound, from side to side, trying to suppress the chill that had overtaken him. Only now did he begin to understand the anguish which he had heard in the voices of the old men recalling the past, who had returned in their imagination to the city in which they previously had lived. Only now did he start to sense how far man now was from his former achievements and conquests. Like a proudly soaring bird, mortally wounded and dropping to the ground in order to hide in a crevice, and having concealed itself there, dies quietly. He recalled an argument of his stepfather and Hunter he had overheard. Will man be able to survive? And even if he can, will he be that same man who had conquered the world and confidently ruled it? Now, when Artyom himself was able to evaluate from what heights mankind had fallen into the precipice, his faith in a beautiful future evaporated once and for all. The straight and broad Kalininsky Prospect moved away from him, gradually tapering, until it dissolved in the dark distance. Now Artyom was standing on the road completely alone, surrounded only by the ghosts and shadows of the past, trying to imagine just how many people once had filled the pavements day and night, how many cars had swept past at fantastic speed in that same place where he was standing, how comfortably and warmly the now empty and black windows of the homes had glowed. Where had it all vanished? The world seemed more deserted and abandoned, but Artyom understood that it was an illusion. The earth had not been abandoned and lifeless. It had simply changed owners. Having thought about it, he turned back toward the library. They were standing motionlessly only 100 or so meters from it, as was he in the middle of the road. There were no fewer than 5 of the creatures, and they no longer intended to hide in the alleys, although they also had not tried to attract his attention. Artyom couldn't understand how they had managed to steal up on him so quickly and silently. These figures were especially distinct in the moonlight, powerful, with developed rear extremities and perhaps even taller than they had seemed to him at first. Though Artyom was unable to see their eyes at such a distance, he knew nonetheless that now they, biding their time, were examining him and sniffing the damp air, getting to know his scent. It must have been that the smell of gunpowder was known to them and had affixed itself to him, and so the beasts still had not decided to attack, observing Artyom from a distance and searching for a sign of uncertainty or weakness in his behavior. Perhaps they were just accompanying Artyom to the boundary of their domain and did not intend to inflict any harm on him. How could he know how creatures that appeared on the earth contrary to the laws of evolution would act? Trying to maintain his self-control, Artyom swung round and with feigned nonchalance continued on, looking over his shoulder every 10 paces. At first, the creature stayed put, but then his worst fears began to be realized. Getting down on all fours, they slowly plodded after him. But as soon as they were only 100 meters from him, they again stopped fast. Although he'd become accustomed to his strange escort, Artyom was afraid to let it out of his sight and held his machine gun at the ready. They walked like this together, along the empty avenue flooded with moonlight. A man, alert, wound up like a spring, stopping and looking back every half-minute, and behind him, 5 or 6 strange creatures, leisurely keeping pace with him. However, it soon seemed to him that the distance they had been maintaining was becoming shorter. Moreover, remaining in a group before this, now the beasts started to fan out, as if trying to outflank him. Artyom never had to deal with a pack of hunting predators before, but for some reason he had no doubts that the creatures were preparing to attack. It was time to act. Turning sharply around, he shouldered his machine gun and caught one of the dark figures in its sight. Their behavior really had changed. This time they didn't stop to wait until he moved further away. They continued to approach him almost imperceptibly, gradually creating a semicircle. He had to try to frighten them away before they succeeded in shortening the distance to the range at which an attack would follow. Artyom lifted the barrel a little and fired into the air. The clatter reverberated from the walls of the high-rises and echoed to the other end of the avenue. The empty clip fell to the asphalt with a clanking sound. And then a deafening roar full of fury was heard, and the beasts dashed forward. They were able to cover the dozens of meters separating them from Artyom in several seconds, but he too was ready. As soon as the beast closest to him was in his sight, he gave it a short burst and started running toward the houses. Judging by the fit of screaming the creature emitted, he had managed to hit it. It was impossible to guess whether it delayed the remaining beasts, or, conversely, it had infuriated them. And then a new cry was heard, not the threatening roar of the beast hunting him, but a long, piercing squawk, which made his blood curdle. It reached him from above, and Artyom understood that a new participant had joined the game. Obviously, the noise of the shots had attracted the attention of a flying monster similar to the one that had spun its nest on the cathedral's dome. A huge shadow swept over his head like a shot. Turning back for a moment, Artyom saw that the beasts had scattered, and only one of them, apparently the one he had wounded, was left in the middle of the street. Continuing to scream, it clumsily lurched towards the building, also hoping to conceal itself there. But it had no chance of being saved. Describing another circle several dozen meters high, The monster folded its enormous leathery wings and fell upon the victim. It dived down so swiftly that Artyom wasn't even able to see what happened next. Having gripped the beast, screeching its final agony, the gigantic hulk lifted its quarry aloft without any visible effort and leisurely carried it to the roof of one of the high-rises. His pursuers didn't immediately break cover, concerned that the monster may return, and Artyom had no time to lose. Pressing himself to the walls of the houses, he ran forward, where, according to his calculations, Sadovoye Koltso should be located. He was able to cover about half a kilometer before he was out of breath, and he looked back to check whether the beasts hunting him had gathered their wits. The avenue was empty, but going several more dozen meters and looking into one of the alleys leading away from New Arbat, Artyom, to his horror, noticed familiar still shadows in it. Now he was beginning to understand why these creatures were in no hurry to come out into the open and preferred to track their victims from the narrow side streets. While hunting for him, they feared attracting the attention of the larger monsters and becoming their prey. Now Artyom had to turn around to look every minute. He remembered that the beasts were able to move extremely quickly and at the same time practically silently, and he feared that they could catch him unawares. The end of the avenue was already visible when they again raced from the alleys and began to surround him. Taught by experience, Artyom at once shot into the air, hoping that that would attract the winged monster as before and frighten off the beasts. They actually froze for a while, standing up on their hind legs and craning their necks. But the sky remained empty. The monster apparently still had not been able to deal with its first victim. Artyom understood sooner than his pursuers and rushed to the right, skirted one of the houses, and dived into the nearest entrance. Though Melnik also had warned him against it, saying that the houses were inhabited, running into such a powerful and mobile enemy as the beasts chasing him in the open would have been insane. They would have torn Artyom to pieces before he was able to pull back the bolt of his machine gun. It was dark in the entrance, and he had to turn on his flashlight. In the round spot of light rose shabby walls covered with obscenities scrawled several decades before, a foul staircase, and the broken doors of ruined and burnt-out apartments. Bold rats scampering around like they owned the place, adding to the picture of desolation. He had chosen the entry wisely. The staircase windows looked out onto the avenue, and climbing to the next floor, he was able to ascertain that the beasts had not decided to follow him. They were stealing up to the front doors, but instead of going into one, surrounded it, squatting on their haunches and again turning into stone statues. Artyom didn't believe that they would back off and allow their prey to elude them. Sooner or later, they would try to reach him from outside, if, of course, nothing was hiding in the entrance, which Artyom himself would be forced to flee. He climbed a story higher, illuminated the doors, and discovered that one of them was closed. He put his shoulder to it and was convinced that it was locked. Without thinking twice, he put the muzzle of the machine gun up to the keyhole, fired, and flung the door open with a kick. When it came down to it, it was all the same to him in which of the apartments he put up a defense. But he was unable to miss his chance to look at an untouched dwelling of the people of a bygone era. First, he slammed shut the door and blocked it with a cabinet standing in the hallway. This barricade would not sustain a serious attack, but at least they couldn't get past it unnoticed. After that, Artyom approached the window and carefully looked outside. It was practically an ideal firing position. From the height of the 4th floor, he was able to see perfectly the approaches to the entrance. There were about 10 beasts sitting in a semicircle around it. Now the advantage was his, and he wasted no time in using it. Switching on the laser gun sight, he put the red dot on the head of the largest of the beasts and, taking a breath, pulled the trigger. A short burst sounded, and the creature soundlessly fell onto its side. The others dashed off in different directions at lightning speed, and a moment later the street was empty. But there was no doubt they didn't intend to go far. Artyom decided to wait it out and be certain that the death of their colleague really had frightened off the remaining beasts. In the meantime, he had a little time in which to study the apartment. Though the glass here, as in the whole house, had been broken long ago, the furniture and all the fittings had been preserved surprisingly well. Small pads had been spread around the floor, resembling the rat poison they used at VDNK. Perhaps that was why Artyom had not noticed one rat in the rooms. The longer he walked around the apartment, the more he was convinced that the residents had not abandoned it in a hurry, but had preserved it, hoping sometime to return. No food had been left in the kitchen to attract rodents or insects, and much of the furniture was carefully wrapped in cellophane. Moving from room to room, Artyom tried to imagine what the everyday life of the people who had lived here had been. How many of them lived here? What time did they get up, arrive home from work, have dinner? Who sat at the head of the table? He knew about many of the jobs, rituals, and things only through books, and now seeing a real dwelling, was convinced that much of what he had imagined earlier was totally wrong. Artyom carefully lifted the semi-transparent polyethylene film and examined the bookshelves. Several colorful children's books stood among the detective stories he knew from the bookstalls in the metro. He grasped one of them at the spine and gently pulled it out. While he paged through the decorative depictions of happy animals, a sheet of cardboard fell from the book. Bending over, Artyom lifted it off the floor. It turned out to be a fading photograph of a smiling woman with a small child in her arms. He was petrified. His heart went into palpitations. Having just been dispersing the blood through his body in measured beats, it suddenly had sped up, beating inappropriately. Artyom terribly wanted to remove his tight gas mask to get a jolt of fresh air if it had not been poisonous. Carefully, as if concerned that the picture turned to dust from his touch, he took it from the shelf and lifted it to his eyes. The woman in the picture was about 30 years old, and the little one in her arms not more than 2, and it was difficult to determine if it was a boy or girl from the funny cap on its head. The child was looking straight at the camera, and its expression was surprisingly grown up and serious. Artyom turned over the photograph, and the glass of his gas mask became clouded. On the other side was written in a blue ballpoint pen, "Little Artyom is 2 years and 5 months old." It was as if they had pulled a rod out of him. His legs went weak and he slid down to the floor, placing the picture in the moonlight falling from the window. Why did the smile of the woman in the photograph seem so familiar to him, so like his own? Why had he begun to feel suffocated as soon as he saw her? More than 10 million people had been living in it before this city perished. Artyom is not the most widely used name, but there had to have been several tens of thousands of children with such a name in a megapolis of many millions. It was as if they called all the present inhabitants of the metro the same. The chance was so small that it simply made no sense to consider it. But why then did the smile of the woman in the photograph seem so familiar to him? He tried to recall scraps of memories about his childhood that sometimes flashed before his mind's eye. A comfortable small room, soft lighting, a woman reading a book, a wide ottoman. He leapt up, passing through the rooms like a whirlwind, trying to find in one of them furniture similar to that of which he had dreamed. It seemed to him in an instant that the furniture in one of the rooms was arranged the same as in his memories. The couch looked a bit different and a window was not there, but this picture may have left something of a distorted imprint on the consciousness of a 3-year-old child. 3 years old. The age on the photograph was different, but this, too, meant nothing. There was no date with the inscription. It could have been taken at any time. It didn't have to be several days before the residents of the apartment had to leave it forever. The photo may have been taken half a year, even a year before this, he convinced himself. Then the age of the boy in the hat in the picture would coincide with his own. Then the probability that he himself was portrayed in the picture, and his mother, would be much greater. But the photograph could have been taken 3 or 5 years before this, an alien voice coldly stated inside him. Could have. Suddenly another thought entered his head. Flinging open the door to the bathroom, he glanced around and almost missed what he was looking for. The mirror was covered with such a layer of dust that it didn't even reflect the light from his flashlight. Artyom removed a towel left by the apartment's owners from its hook and wiped off the mirror. The area he cleared revealed his reflection in gas mask and helmet. He illuminated himself with the flashlight and looked into the mirror. His drawn, emaciated face was not entirely visible beneath the plastic visor of the gas mask, but the look of the deeply sunken dark eyes, barely making its way back from the mirror, suddenly seemed to him similar to the look of the boy in the photograph. Artyom brought the photograph to his face, looked intently at the boy's tiny face, and then looked at the mirror. Again, he held the light on the picture, and again he looked at his own face beneath the gas mask, trying to recall how it looked the last time he saw his reflection. When was that? Not long before he had left VNK, but it was impossible to say how much time had passed since then. Judging by the man he saw in the mirror now, several years, if only he could pull off this damned mask and compare himself with the child in the photo. Of course, people now and then become unrecognizable while growing up, but something remains in the face of everyone that reminds one of their distant childhood. There was one possibility. When he returned to VDNK, he could ask Sukhoi if the woman smiling at him now from the piece of paper looked like the woman, condemned to be devoured by the rats, who had handed the child's life over to him at the station. Looked like his mother. Though her face was then distorted in a grimace of despair and supplication, Sukhoi would recognize her. He had a fine memory. He would be able to say precisely who was in the photo. Was it her or not? Artyom examined the picture again. Then, with an unaccustomed tenderness, he stroked the woman's image, carefully put the photograph into the little book out of which it had fallen, and put it away into his rucksack. It was strange, he thought. Only several hours ago, he was in the largest storehouse of knowledge on the continent, where he could take for himself any of the millions of very different volumes, many of which were simply invaluable. But he had left them gathering dust on the shelves, and the thought never even crossed his mind to profit from the riches of the library. Instead, he was taking a cheap children's book with unpretentious drawings, and yet he felt as if he had gained the greatest of the world's treasures. Artyom returned to the hall, intending to leaf through the remaining books from the shelf, and perhaps even look into the cupboards in search of photograph albums. But lifting his eyes towards the window, he felt the almost imperceptible changes there. An uneasiness seized him. Something wasn't right. Approaching nearer, he understood what was wrong. The night's color was changing, and yellowish rose tints had appeared in it. It was getting light. The beasts were sitting next to the entrance, hesitating to go inside. The dead body of their companion was nowhere to be seen, but whether the winged giant had carried it away or they had torn it to pieces themselves was unclear. Artyom didn't understand what kept them from taking the apartment by storm, but for the time being it suited him. Would he manage to reach Smolenskaya before sunrise? More importantly, would he be able to get away from his pursuers? It was possible to remain in the barricaded apartment, hide from the rays of the sun in the bathroom, wait until they chased away these predatory creatures, and set out when darkness fell. But how long would the protective suit last? How long was his gas mask filter estimated to last? What would Melnik undertake, not finding him in the agreed place at the agreed time? Artyom approached the door leading to the stairwell and listened. Silence. He carefully moved the cabinet away and slowly opened the door a little. There was no one there, but having illuminated the staircase with his flashlight, Artyom noticed something he had not seen earlier. A thick, transparent slime coated the steps. It looked as if something had just crawled down them, leaving a trail behind. The trail had not approached the apartment door where he had spent all this time, but this didn't console Artyom. Did it mean the abandoned houses were not as empty as they had seemed? Now he no longer wanted to stay in the apartment, let alone sleep here. There was only one possibility: to drive away the beasts and to try to run to Smolenskaya, and to do it before the sun burnt his eyes and the unseen monsters awoke. This time he aimed not as carefully, but tried to damage the predatory beasts as much as possible. 2 of them roared and tumbled to the ground, and the others disappeared into the alleys. It seemed the road was clear. Artyom ran down carefully, concerned about an ambush, looked out of the entrance, and rushed with all his strength towards Sadovoye Koltso. What a nightmarish thicket must be there in the gardens on this ring, he thought, if even the thin strips of trees on the boulevards had, after all these years, been converted to dark labyrinths. not to mention the botanical gardens and what must be growing there. His pursuers had given him a head start while gathering into a pack, and he was able to reach almost the very end of the avenue. It was becoming ever more light, but the sun's rays apparently did not daunt these beasts at all. Breaking into two groups, they rushed along, shortening with every passing second the distance separating them from Artyom. Here in the open space, the advantage was with them. Artyom was unable to stop to fire. At the same time, they were shifting to all fours, and their silhouettes did not rise more than a meter above the ground. They almost merged with the road. No matter how fast Artyom tried to run, the protective suit, rucksack, 2 machine guns, and fatigue accumulated during the seemingly endless night were making themselves felt. Soon these hellhounds would overtake him and take their toll, he thought with despair. He recalled the deformed but powerful bodies of the monsters lying in pools of blood at the entrance where his burst of machine gun fire had toppled them. Artyom had no time to examine them, but even one look was enough to engrave them on his memory for a long time. Glossy brown hair, huge round heads, and mouths studded with dozens of small sharp teeth that, it seemed, grew in several rows. Going over in his mind all the animals known to him, Artyom was unable to recall one that would have been able to produce such beasts, even after the effects of radiation. Fortunately, there were no trees growing at Sadavoye Koltso. It was simply one more broad street, extending right and left from the intersection as far as the eye could see. Before breaking into a run again, Artyom let off a short burst at the beasts without looking. They were already less than 50 meters from him and again had broken up into a semicircle so that some were moving almost level with him. At Sadavoye, he had to look for the road among several huge craters 5 to 6 meters deep and make a detour in one place in order to skirt a deep crevice that split the road surface in two. The structures standing close by looked strange. Rather than being burnt, they appeared more to have been melted. It created the impression that something peculiar had happened here, that this region had endured much more than Kalininsky Prospect. And something like several hundred meters in the distance arose a building of inconceivable size. It looked like a medieval castle and was a majestic and somber background to this troubled landscape, untouched by time or fire. Artyom glanced up for a split second, and he let go a sigh of relief. A scary winged shadow soared over the castle, and that could become his salvation. He only had to attract its attention so that it busied itself with his pursuers. Lifting the machine gun in one hand and aiming the barrel at the flying monster, he squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. He had run out of ammunition. It was difficult to drag the reserve machine gun hanging on his back forward while running. Diving into one of the nearest alleys, Artyom leaned against the wall and changed weapons. Now he didn't have to let the beasts come close while he emptied the magazine in the second machine gun. The first of them already had appeared from around the corner and sat on its hindquarters with the customary movement, extending itself to all its huge height. It had grown bolder and had approached so close that now Artyom was able to see its eyes for the first time, small, concealed beneath massive brows burning with an evil green fire similar to the gleam of that mysterious flame in the park. There was no laser sight on Daniel's Kalashnikov, but one normally couldn't miss from such a distance. He framed the figure of the beast standing stock in his sight. Artyom squeezed the machine gun more tightly to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. Moving slowly to the center, the bolt stopped. What had happened? Could he really have confused the machine guns in his haste? Absolutely not, for his weapon had a laser sight. Artyom tried to wrench the bolt. It was stuck. A whirlwind of thoughts swirled in his head. Daniel, the librarians. That was why his comrade had not resisted when that gray monster attacked him in the labyrinth of books. His machine gun simply had not worked. He, most likely, had pulled the bolt just as spasmodically while the librarian dragged him into the depths of the corridors. There was silence as two more beasts appeared, like specters. They were studying Artyom intently. He was looking in despair at Daniel's machine gun. It seemed that they were drawing their own conclusions. The closest of the creatures, most likely the leader, jumped and now was only 5 meters from Artyom. At this moment, a gigantic shadow swept over their heads. The beasts pressed themselves to the ground and lifted their heads. Taking advantage of their confusion, Artyom dashed to one of the arches, no longer hoping to come out of this mess alive, but just trying instinctively to postpone the moment of his death. He had not the slightest chance against them in the alleys, but the way back to Sadovoye Koltso already had been cut off. He ended up in the middle of an empty square, bounded along the edges by the walls of houses, in which arches and passages could be seen. That same gloomy castle that had impressed him at Sadovoye Koltso rose into the sky behind the building he was facing. Finally tearing his gaze away from it, Artyom saw writing on the building opposite: the Moscow 6th Lenin Underground Railroad, and a bit lower, Smolenskaya Station. The high oak doors were ajar. It was hard to say how he managed to evade them. He felt a premonition of danger and the sensation of a light air current, was aware of a predator dashing towards its prey. The beast landed only a half-meter from him. Easing sideways, he broke into a run and dashed with all his might towards the entrance to the metro. His home was there, his world. There beneath the ground, he again would become master of the situation. The Smolenskaya vestibule looked exactly as Artyom had expected. Dark, gray, empty. It at once became clear that the people at this station often came to the surface. The ticket booths and office facilities were open and ransacked, and everything of use had been moved underground many years ago. Neither the turnstiles nor the booths for the staff remained, their concrete foundations a mere reflection of what once had been. The arch of the tunnel was visible, and several escalators reached down to incredible depths. The flashlight's beam was lost somewhere in the middle of the descent, and Artyom was unable to ascertain that there really was an entrance there. But it was impossible to stay where he was. The beasts had already penetrated into the vestibule. He knew because he heard the creaking of the door. In a few seconds they would reach the escalators, and that tiny head start he still had would disappear. Awkwardly stepping along the shaking grooved steps, Artyom began his descent. He tried to hop across several steps, but his foot slipped on the damp covering and he crashed downward, striking the back of his head on a corner. He managed to stop only when he had hit about 10 steps with his helmet and the small of his back. Searching the section of the way behind him with his light, Artyom discovered exactly what he was looking for and was afraid to find: the stationary dark figures. As was their custom before they attacked, they stood stock still, studying the situation or conferring inaudibly. Artyom turned round and again tried to jump over 2 steps. This time it turned out better for him, and sliding his right hand along the rubber of the handrail while grasping his flashlight in his left, he ran for about another 20 seconds before he fell again. He heard heavy stomping from behind. The creatures were determined. Artyom hoped with his whole being that the old stairs woefully creaking beneath his lighter weight would just collapse, not sustaining the weight of his pursuers. But the clatter approaching from the shadows was evidence that the escalator was handling the load well. A brick wall with a large door in the middle appeared in the beam of his flashlight. Only about 20 meters remained to it, no more. Rising to his feet with difficulty, Artyom covered the final stretch in 15 seconds. It seemed like an eternity. The door was made of steel plates and echoed resonantly like a bell at the blows of his fists. Artyom pounded at it with all his might. The approaching shadows, which he saw dimly in the semi-darkness, were spurring him on. Only after several seconds did he understand, a sudden chill overcoming him, what a terrible mistake he had just made. Instead of knocking at the door with the prearranged code, he had only alarmed the guards. Now it was most probable that there was no way it would be unlocked under any circumstances. It didn't matter who was trying to enter, and the fact that the sun was rising already made it even less likely that the door would be opened. Just how did the prearranged signal sound? 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick? Absolutely not. That's an SOS. It was exactly 3 at the beginning and 3 at the end, but he was no longer able to recall quick or slow. And if he were to begin to experiment now, he could forget about any hope of getting inside. Better, the SOS. At least then the guards would understand that a man was on the other side of the door. Having banged on the steel once more, Artyom pulled the submachine gun from his shoulder and, with hands shaking, replaced the clip in it. Then he pressed the light to the weapon's barrel and nervously outlined the upward stretching arches with it. Long shadows from the surviving lamps covered each other in the wandering beam of his light, and it was impossible to guarantee that a dark silhouette didn't lurk in one of them. As before, it remained completely quiet on the other side of the iron door. Lord, it's really not Smolenskaya, Artyom thought. Maybe this entrance was blocked up decades ago and no one has used it since then. He had got here completely by accident, not following the instructions of the stalker at all. And he may have been wrong. The stairs creaked very near to him, about 15 meters away. Not able to bear it, Artyom let loose a burst of machine gun fire in the direction from which the sound had been heard. The echo pained Artyom's ears, but nothing like the howl of a wounded beast was heard. The shots were wasted. Not having the courage to look away, Artyom pressed his back against the door and again began to pound with his fist on the iron. 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick. He thought he heard a heavy metallic grinding sound from the door, but just at that moment the figure of a predator flew from the shadows with a startling speed. Artyom held the submachine gun suspended in his right hand and pressed the trigger almost by accident when he instinctively recoiled backwards. The bullet swept the body of the creature in the air, and instead of seizing Artyom by the throat, it collapsed on the last steps of the escalator, having flown not 2 meters. But only a moment later it raised itself and, ignoring the blood gushing from its wound, moved forward. Then, staggering, it leapt again and pressed Artyom to the cold steel of the door. It was no longer able to attack. The last bullets had struck its head, and the beast was dead already by the end of its lunge. But the inertia of its body would have been enough to crack Artyom's skull had he not been wearing a helmet. The door opened, and a bright white light burst out. A frightened roar was heard from the escalators. Judging by the sound, there were no fewer than 5 of these beasts there now. Someone's strong hands grasped him by the collar and pulled him inside, and the metal clanged once more. They shut the door and bolted it. "Are you injured?" someone's voice next to him asked. "Damned if he knows," another answered. "Did you see who he brought with him? We barely scared them away the last time, and even then only by using gas. Leave him, he's with me." "Artyom! Hey, Artyom, come to your senses!" someone familiar called, and Artyom opened his eyes with difficulty. 3 men were leaning over him. 2 of them, most likely the gate guards, were dressed in dark gray jackets and knitted caps, and both wore bulletproof vests. With a sigh of relief, Artyom recognized Melnik as the third. "So is this him or what?" one of the guards asked with some disappointment. "Then take him, only don't forget about the quarantine and the decontamination." "Any more lectures?" The stalker grinned. "Stand up, Artyom. It's been a long time," he said, extending his hand to him. Artyom tried to stand up, but his legs refused to work. He swayed and began to feel sick, and he was groggy. "We have to get him to the infirmary. You help me and you close the pressure doors," Melnik commanded. While the doctor examined him, Artyom studied the white tiles of the operating room. It was sparkling clean. There was the sharp smell of bleach in the air, and several fluorescent lamps were fastened just beneath the ceiling. There were also a few operating tables there, and a box with instruments ready for use hung next to each one. The condition of the little hospital here was impressive, but why peaceful Smolenskaya needed it was unclear to Artyom. No fractures, only bruises. "Several scratches. We have disinfected them," the doctor said, wiping his hands with a clean towel. "Can you leave us for a bit?" Melnik asked the doctor. "I would like to discuss something in private." Nodding knowingly, the medic left. The stalker, having sat down on the edge of the couch on which Artyom was lying, demanded the details of what had happened. By his estimate, Artyom was supposed to show up at Smolenskaya 2 hours earlier, and Melnik had already started planning to go up to the surface to try to find him. He listened to the end to the story about the pursuit, but with no special interest, and he called the flying monsters by a dictionary word, pterodactyl. But only the story about how Artyom had concealed himself at the front door really impressed him. Learning that while he was sitting snugly in his apartment, someone was creeping along the staircase, the stalker frowned. "Are you certain that you didn't step in the slime on the stairs?" He shook his head. "God forbid you bring that crap into the station. I've been telling you not to go near the houses. Consider yourself really lucky that it didn't decide to drop in on you when you were making your visit." Melnik stood up, went to the entrance where Artyom's boots had been left, and meticulously examined the soles of each of them. Not having found anything suspicious, he put them back. As I have also said, the road to Paulus is prohibited to you for the time being. I have not been able to tell the Brahmins the truth. Therefore, they think that you both disappeared during the trip to the library, and I was sent out to search for you. So what happened there to your partner? Artyom told him the whole story once more from beginning to end, this time honestly explaining just exactly how Daniel had died. The stalker winced. It's better you keep this to yourself. To be honest, I liked the first version a lot more. The second will cause too many questions from the Brahmins. Their man was killed by you. You didn't find the books, so the reward remained yours. And by the way, he added, looking sullenly at Artyom, what was in that envelope? Raising himself on his elbow, Artyom took from his pocket a bag covered with dried blood, looked at Melnik attentively, and opened it.